This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, November 14th, 1918, Henry Ford starts to press for a recount in his race against Truman Newberry after losing the 1918 Senate election in Michigan a couple weeks earlier. This was, yes, that Henry Ford, one of the wealthiest and most prominent businessmen in the country, taking a foray into electoral politics. He ran a somewhat haphazard campaign, no real strategy, mostly banking on his name recognition. And then after, at first, accepting the results of the election, he started to have second thoughts that maybe something fishy had happened, and he began to agitate and whip up his supporters. And facts be damned, in the end, he did manage to take down Newberry by muddying the waters and painting his opponent as illegitimate. So, folks, does this sound like a familiar pattern and familiar behavior? Not to mention the fact that Ford built much of his political career on xenophobia and paranoia. I promise we won't try and spend the whole time drawing parallels to now, but this is a really fascinating story. We haven't talked about Ford and politics before, so I'm glad we are getting to this. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I'm curious, and we should get into this, but just very quickly, did you read this story and say, like, oh my gosh, Trump, parallels, or is that just kind of the headspace I'm in?
Yes, absolutely.
Not you, NIki?
That wasn't where my head went.
Interesting.
In part because, there's so much that's so fascinating about this story, but also, as we'll talk about, it is through and through a progressive era story that I was very, very sunk into that moment.
Totally.
How is it, though, that of all the episodes we've covered, we haven't done Ford and politics? That's astounding to me because he is a character.
To put it mildly.
Yeah, and it is kind of one of those, I would say, in the canon of, like, when you dig a little deeper into American history, you have this moment where you learn about Henry Ford and anti-Semitism and kind of helps you paint the picture of the Between the Wars era. So it is a classic kind of like sweet spot for the kind of conversations we have on the show. But here we are, and this is the lens through which we'll do it, this 1918 Senate race, which actually is an interesting sort of pivot point for Ford, right? And actually a lot of his kind of more abhorrent thoughts come, I would say, in the wake of this. But let's talk about this race for Senate in 1918, who he's running against, and then, why he starts to kind of raise some questions about the legitimacy of the election.
So he's running against a man named Truman Newberry, excellent name, who was also a businessman. He was also a kind of industrialist who worked in the steel industry and had made his money that way. So these are two fairly wealthy men running against one another in what is a moment when Senate elections are kind of a brand new thing. Right. The 17th Amendment is put into effect in 1913, which allows for the direct election of senators who had been chosen by state legislatures before this moment. So everybody's trying this let's elect our senators thing out. And so you have these two men running against one another. They initially run against one another in the Republican primary. And Newberry wins that. He spends a whole lot of money, which we'll talk about. And then Woodrow Wilson, who's the president at the time and trying to hold on to a Democratic majority in the Senate, goes to Ford and he's like, you came close in the primary. You want to try it again in the general? And that's how this race gets set up.
All of this is just kind of wild to me because Ford is not a politician. He's not someone that you would expect to run for office. He's not someone who likes giving speeches. He's not very political. He has a lot of strong views, but he's not the kind of person that's like, put me in, coach. And so I got the sense that while he's doing this campaign, he wants to win. It seems like more for ego than it does feel like he wants to win to like change people's lives for the better. But you get a sense of that. I don't know. I think of like if this were like Steve Jobs running for office or something like that. That kind of like person who's an inventor or a forward thinker, but not really someone who's working for like, the man on the bottom necessarily.
NIki, what do you make of that?
You know, he does start to dip his toes into politics at a moment when a lot of people are expressing their views, particularly about the U.S. entry into World War I. So he's a kind of non-interventionist in this way that some far-right figures will end up being. He doesn't want to go to war. He uses his money to keep his son out of the draft. So he's becoming like a more political figure in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I think that he would have liked to have become a senator. He just thought that in kind
for
of
the
that
power,
old
though.
Yeah.
For like
Oh,
do
yeah.
good.
Yeah,
No, but
yeah.
that's right. I think that's like it's the distinction between politics and power, and he's interested in power.
Yes,
and politics
yes.
is a way to that. You mentioned some of his planks or some of his political positions, NIki. I can't help but also notice that he was like railing against patent laws, which I don't know the history of patent law. I don't know exactly that position, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there's probably some business interest in that particular platform. So yes, I think we kind of have a sense of
But
why.
this is kind of what I mean. Like, what constituents are like, you know what we need? We need someone to go after patent law. like, it's 1918, you know, like this is, I mean, way before the Depression and all of that stuff. But times are still tenuous. It's, you know, in a post-war moment, like that would not be the top 3 or 5 things that voters would be thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, and remember, this is also when the flu pandemic is underway as well. Like there's some bigger issues at play in this moment.
Yeah. This election, you know, in addition to having this kind of businessman, high name recognition, creature of business, sort of dabbling in politics, is also a very modern campaign in the sense that, well, one, a lot of money is spent on this campaign. I mean, I think Ford kind of forces Newberry's hand to start to spend, you know, millions of dollars in today's dollars on this. But we also have the traditional kind of 19th century stuff of handbills and buttons, but then we also have radio, billboard, newspaper ads. There's committees being formed. So it really is this interesting inflection moment just in the kind of nature of the way campaigns are run. And especially, I would say, you know, often Senate campaigns or quote unquote local elections don't get this kind of machinery behind them, but we start to see that in this moment. It starts to emerge.
Yeah. And it is butting up against, as we'll talk about, some new reforms that are trying to make elections better and cleaner. So there was a Federal Corrupt Practices Act that was put in place in order to try to get some of this money out of elections. This is a period where you're doing like civil service reform. All of these good government types are trying to make elections better, more fair, more democratic. And so you have now people voting for senators, and you also have limits on how much money campaigns are supposed to spend on their races. I think the cap was something around $3,700, and Newberry spends $175,000 on his primary campaign against Ford. Like this, that is not $3,700. That is many multiples of it.
Yeah, $2 million in today's dollars, which is
That's
again
the ultimate
no small
number
amount
being spent. Yeah. So even before the election, Newberry has this sort of stink of money and campaign finance on his campaign. He ends up beating Ford. And this, I guess, is where the sort of dynamic that makes me think of some of the things we're watching play out in politics happen today. Because in the wake of that, you have Ford start to sour on the result and start to raise some questions and want to push back. And sitting right there to kind of wrap around that narrative is this very real corruption or questions or kind of narrative about Newberry. And so it feels opportunistic in all sorts of different ways. But can we just linger in that moment, in late November, where Ford starts to ask questions? Why is it that he starts to say maybe this election wasn't legit?
Well, first of all, it was a very close election. They were separated by about 7,500 votes in an election where 450,000 votes were cast. So a close, tight election. There had been all of this money being spent. And Ford, who had initially gone along with it, starts casting about. He'd already made lots of anti-Semitic comments. So he's not like turned into an anti-Semite in this moment, but he is talking to other people in his campaign. He says maybe there should be a recount, and he then attaches it to this broader set of conspiracy theories about Jews. He argues that Wall Street code for Jews, had conspired to steal the election for Newberry because he opposed President Wilson.
Yeah, and he's also, I mean, he's hiring private investigators to look into all of this. He hires about 40 private investigators to find as much dirt as you possibly can to try to get a recount, to try to make this election win as illegitimate as it possibly can be, at least within the eyes of the public, even if he can't get the outcome that he wants. He wants an asterisk mark next to this win.
Yeah.
Right. And he wants to keep Newberry from being seated. Right. So even before Newberry is seated, I think he's seated in May of 1919 in the Senate. There are investigations that are ongoing, that are happening in the Senate, that are happening within the federal government to try to determine, like, A, was this a fair election? And B, what do we make of all of this money that was flowing through the Newberry campaign?
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
A couple other things here, just to kind of try to understand this moment in Ford's evolution. I mean, in this very moment, in the fall, he runs, he has this unsuccessful campaign. He starts to ask questions about it. He also resigns as the head of the Ford Motor Company. And so you get this picture of a person who's like, this is my new chapter, politics. This is my new world now. And he's sort of seeing it slip through his fingers, right? And so he's kind of clawing to hold on to it. And, again, I don't have to connect the dots here, but you get this picture of this man who kind of says, like, there's this new sphere of influence that I want to work my way into, and I'm going to do what I can to hold on to that. I guess we should just jump ahead and point out that, well, first off, Ford eventually, there's a bunch of points on the timetable here, but if Ford eventually does get a recount, the vote tallies hardly change. So, it's clear Newberry wins this. But this just adds another sort of straw on the camel's back of these allegations against Newberry, who then eventually does get unseated, right? He enters Congress. He get in the following spring. There's all these questions about campaign finance and propriety, and eventually he is forced to resign. So in some way, Ford does get his wish.
He's forced to resign, but I mean, there is a lot that happens between 1919 when he's seated and 1922 when he finally vacates his seat. He is put on trial. He's brought up on charges of the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, along with like 130 of his closest friends. And he is found responsible for breaking that law. But then it goes to the Supreme Court. Yeah. And the Supreme Court actually finds the law unconstitutional. It's a 5-4 ruling, so it's contested. And so ultimately, yes, corruption probably, but there's not that conviction that would really drive it home.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but by then, the damage is done. Right. I mean, both. I would even say to some extent, both men have sort of had their reputations smeared because it's just gotten ugly and out of hand and prolonged for so long that it doesn't really bode well for both men. I mean, Ford also winds up stepping down from his company as well and handing the reins over to his son, Edsel.
Right. But Ford has this opportunity. He's operating outside the spheres of politics, the constrictions and the regulations of politics. I mean, this feels to me like a moment where he kind of gets to be unleashed in terms of his deepening anti-Semitism. He starts a newspaper in this moment. I mean, I see him really kind of like spiraling down or into this sort of feverish moment. And so, he retains a sort of deep influence there that maybe he wouldn't have had he just been, another random senator from Michigan.
Right. And it's not just any newspaper. It's the Dearborn Independent. And one of the first things that it does is it serializes an English language version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this fabricated anti-Semitic screed. It's like kind of the text of anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so he's like going whole hog into his anti-Semitism within like a year or two of running for Senate. And that is going to be his big legacy in the 1920s, is to spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
Yeah. So I have a kind of bigger thought here. I'm curious what you make of it. And it's sort of half-baked. But I see in this story something that like I think about a lot, especially in the kind of current era. But, you know, I have this instinct in me that like electoral politics, generally speaking, are moderating, right? Because you have to kind of talk to a bunch of people. You try and build a coalition. You have to kind of like convince folks across a spectrum that you are tenable. But then you get these other moments where an electoral politics experience feels like radicalizing and sort of sends someone down a spiral. And I see that here. And frankly, I see it with Donald Trump, you know, and I think it has a little to do with the kind of mechanics of elections. But I just kind of, I don't know, I just find myself thinking a lot about that, about like, why do some figures not dabble in politics and realize like, oh, we live in a multicultural, diverse country with a lot of opinion and I kind of have to get my way that way. And instead they just go, no. I'm heading right down this rabbit hole.
I mean, I think part of that is just how power functions, especially among white men, as a sense of entitlement. Like, this is what I'm owed. This is what I deserve. And you can't stop me. And that kind of like, I mean, there are so many accounts of people who talked about Ford and just said, this guy's a jerk. Like, this guy is a horrible father. This guy is not kind. He is, you know, there was nothing about him that people would sort of be endeared to, I think. And politicians have to, you know, they have to shake hands and kiss babies and sort of be endearing to some people. Ford is none of those things.
I think that word entitlement is really important because it fuels this kind of resentment. And it forms a kind of populism that doesn't come from being dispossessed. It comes from this belief that, like, I am entitled to rule. I have somehow been thwarted from the power that I am entitled to. Therefore, nefarious forces have kept me from doing that. So it leads into conspiracy theories and all these sorts of things. And it can really fuel a movement. And elections are such a test case for that because you really have it on paper, right? I put my name out there for this thing that I should have won. Here, I'm looking at the results. I didn't win. I didn't get the seat. And it can be a radicalizing moment.
Yeah.
Especially when you don't win and you have all the money in the world. I mean, money is like the access key to so many different avenues. I mean, you can't open that door regardless of how much money you have. I think that also builds, like what NIki said, resentment.
Yeah. It's like I have this natural inclination against psychologizing folks as an explanation for stuff, but sometimes really it is, you know, the case. And these are, and like cult of personality and someone's personal kind of headspace and personality like plays into it. I think Ford is certainly one of those singular figures where that does explain a lot. All right. Well, let's leave it there. Thanks to folks who have asked us to touch on the Henry Ford story. I'm sure we will do more, especially in those kind of next 10 years or so of his deepening anti-Semitism. But as we often do, we will wrap up with some also on this days. So it is November 14th in 1851. Also on this day, Herman Melville publishes Moby Dick. First time published here in the United States. I don't know. We talked about the exploding whale a while back. So maybe, but I think it's the best. I think it's probably my favorite book, if I had to pick. I mean, it is really kind of incredible. I try and read it every 5 years.
It's a beautiful book.
It is. Also in 1881, the trial begins for President James Garfield's assassin, Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau's trial was one of the first motor trials in which the defendant's claim of insanity was subject to modern legal test, and he was hung June of 1882 as well.
Have we done that one? Have we done Garfield's
I'm trying to remember if we did, because of, we also mentioned civil service reform, and Guiteau was motivated to the assassination, well, both by his levels of sanity, but also by some of these reforms.
Yeah.
It was also on this day in 1915 that African-American educator Booker T. Washington died in Tuskegee, Alabama. He would forevermore after be used as a kind of touchstone in debates over Black uplift and how best to achieve civil rights, economic rights, and the rest.
And in 1999, Naomi Wolf told Al Gore to wear more earth tones.
This is such a good one. We haven't done it. We have to do it.
We have to do this.
It was right
one.
around this time, but Naomi Wolf, who's a very fascinating character, got brought into the Gore campaign, right, to do some consulting. And I don't know, consultants got to say stuff in order to earn their money. And so she said, wear more earth tones. And that got out and became a whole thing.
It's crazy. Brown, olive.
We haven't done enough Al Gore on this show, I think.
Totally
Really
agree. And as the person holding down the fort here in Tennessee, I think we've got to do more Gore.
For sure.
We will leave it there. Reminder that coming in 2024, our newsletter is going to be built around also on this day, is also on this week. So go ahead and sign up for that now and send us your suggestions as we head through November and into December for stuff that happened on this day. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia. From